The moment you awaken, you don't stop loving people, you simply lose the ability to pretend that what drains your soul still belongs in your life. Have you noticed that the more you understand yourself, the less you can pretend with certain people? That the conversations that once felt normal now feel like a slow suffocation. Words exchanged, pleasantries maintained, the right amount of nodding at the right moments, and yet something in you sitting very still, waiting for it to be over? And what if this growing intolerance were not a sign that you are becoming cold, but proof that something in you has finally learned to breathe? Carl Jung spent decades studying what happens when a human being begins the long, difficult work of becoming genuinely themselves. He called this process individuation, not self-improvement in the way we usually mean it, not the optimization of habits or the refinement of skills, but something far more disorienting, the gradual integration of everything you are, including the parts you were taught to hide, the parts that made others uncomfortable, the parts you buried so early and so deeply that you forgot they were yours to begin with. Individuation is not a project you complete. It is a passage you enter, and it changes the country you are walking through. And here is what Jung understood, that most people who speak about growth prefer to leave out. The process does not only change you, it changes what you can tolerate. It changes who you can sit with. It changes the texture of certain silences from companionable to unbearable. This is not cruelty. It is not arrogance. It is something far more precise. The moment your interior life becomes real enough to you that you can no longer pretend it does not exist in order to keep someone else comfortable. The people who were built for the version of you that no longer exists will not always understand this. They will experience your growing self-awareness, not as your liberation, but as their loss. Some of them will call it coldness. Some will call it pride. A few will call it betrayal. And perhaps the hardest thing you will have to hold is that they are not entirely wrong. Something has been lost, the old arrangement is over, the version of you that fit neatly into their world has quietly stepped aside. You did not announce it. You may not have even chosen it consciously, but it happened nonetheless. Before that passage began, you were doing something you may only now be able to name. You were carrying, not your own weight alone, but the accumulated discomfort of the people around you, distributed across your silence, your compliance, your readiness to smooth whatever edge threatened to cause friction. Someone in the room grew tense and you adjusted. Someone's mood darkened and you softened your voice. Someone's insecurity surfaced and you quietly made yourself smaller so they would not have to feel it. You called this being considerate. You called it keeping things easy. And you were so practiced at it that it did not even register as a choice. It felt like simply who you were. Jung would have recognized this immediately. What you were doing, long before you had the vocabulary to describe it, was a survival strategy. Not chosen deliberately, but learned early, perhaps very early, in an environment where your emotional honesty cost too much, where being fully yourself created too much disruption, too much disapproval, too much distance from the people you needed. So you adapted. You learned to scan a room before you entered it. You learned to modulate yourself in real time, adjusting your volume, your opinions, your needs, reading the atmosphere the way a sailor reads weather. You became extraordinarily good at it. And the tragedy is not that you developed this skill. The tragedy is that you came to believe it was your personality. Jung called what you were showing the world the persona, the mask, constructed at the threshold between your inner life and the expectations of those around you. And the persona is not a deception exactly. It is a necessary instrument. Every person who lives among others wears one to some degree. The question Jung kept pressing was not whether you have a mask, but whether you know you are wearing it, whether you remember there is a face underneath, whether the mask has been on so long that you have begun to forget which one is you. The awakening, when it comes, does not announce itself grandly. It arrives more often as an exhaustion, a specific, quiet exhaustion that has nothing to do with how much sleep you have had. It is the exhaustion of performing a version of yourself that no longer fits, for an audience that has grown accustomed to the performance and would prefer you not stop. And perhaps that is where the river finds you. Imagine a river that for years ran underground. Not by nature, by necessity. The city above it was built without asking the water's permission, and so the river was rerouted, channeled into pipes and gutters and holding tanks, made to flow where the infrastructure demanded, rather than where the current naturally pulled. For years it cooperated. It learned the shape of the pipes. It became small enough to be useful, and from above, no one thought to ask whether the river minded, because the river had been quiet for so long that its silence was taken for consent. But pressure builds in things that are forced underground. Not overnight and not dramatically, slowly, the way feeling accumulates in a body that has been trained not to show it. And one day the river finds a crack, and then a gap, and then the surface. The city calls it a flood. Residents call it damage. Engineers are summoned to contain it again. The river does not call it anything. The river is simply moving the way water was always meant to move. What others have been calling your harshness, your sudden unwillingness to absorb, to smooth, to make yourself smaller in rooms where you used to disappear quietly, is perhaps not harshness at all. It is water finding its course. It is pressure that was never intended to be permanent, finally releasing. And the people most disturbed by this are not necessarily the people who mean you harm. They are simply the ones who built their comfort on the assumption that you would remain underground. Now sit with that, not as an accusation toward them, but as an honest inventory of yourself. How many times did you laugh at something that made you feel smaller? Not because it was funny, but because laughter was the instrument that kept the tension from becoming visible, that allowed everyone in the room to pretend the moment had not happened. How many rooms did you walk into already apologizing, not with words, but with your posture, with the way you angled your body to take up less space, with the preemptive softness in your voice that communicated, "I know I might be too much, and I am sorry for that in advance." How many times did you call your own silence keeping the peace, when what you were actually keeping was everyone else's comfort at the expense of your own truth, your own presence, your own right to exist, without apology, in the rooms you had every reason to enter? These are not small questions. They deserve to sit without rushing toward an answer. Because what Jung understood, and what the persona concept makes quietly devastating once you see it, is that the mask is not just what you show to strangers, it is what you show to people who have known you for years. Perhaps especially to them, the persona calcifies most deeply in the relationships where the stakes felt highest, where belonging felt most conditional, where the early lesson was that the version of you that told the truth was harder to love than the version that accommodated. And so you learned, as most people learn, without ever being taught explicitly, to offer the accommodating version first, to lead with softness, to arrive already trimmed. The exhaustion that comes before the awakening is the exhaustion of keeping that trim in place, of waking each morning and resuming the performance before you are even fully conscious, of monitoring every sentence before it leaves you, asking not, "Is this true?" but, "Will this be welcome?" And at some point, there is no predicting when, the cost of maintenance exceeds the return. The mask, which once gave you belonging, begins to feel like the very thing preventing it. Because you are not being known, you are being liked, and you begin to suspect, slowly and then all at once, that those are not the same thing. That suspicion is the crack in the pipe. And what flows through it is not anger exactly, though anger may come. What flows first is clarity, a kind of sight that you cannot unsee once it arrives. You begin to notice which conversations ask you to be less than you are, which rooms require a version of you that you can only sustain at cost, which relationships were never built around who you actually are, but around the role you agreed, without fully knowing you were agreeing, to play. This is not cynicism. It is the beginning of something far more demanding than cynicism. Cynicism closes. This opens, painfully, uncertainly, but genuinely. You are not becoming cold. You are becoming specific about where your warmth goes. And that specificity, that growing sense of where your warmth belongs and where it is simply being consumed, is what the people around you will sometimes read as coldness. They will call it distance. They will call it pride. Some of them, the ones who needed you most available, will call it betrayal. And perhaps the most disorienting part of this passage is that you will understand why they feel that way, even as you cannot go back. Carl Jung called this individuation, the slow, lifelong process of becoming who you actually are, beneath the accumulated layers of expectation and performance. But he was honest about its cost, in a way that his more optimistic readers sometimes forget. He understood that the self you are growing into will not be legible to everyone who knew the self you are leaving behind. The people who were comfortable with your edges smoothed down, your reactions swallowed, your silence mistaken for agreement, they did not sign up for your expansion. They signed up for your accommodation, and when accommodation becomes impossible, they experience your growth as a kind of loss, which, for them, it genuinely is. That is worth sitting with, not to make you responsible for their grief, but to release you from the guilt of causing it. There is a face passing through your mind right now, someone whose presence has begun to cost you more than it returns. You already know the dynamic. You already feel the specific weight of it. What may be harder to see is that this pattern will not end with this person. Once the mechanism is in motion, it finds a new face, a new form, a slightly different arrangement of the same essential transaction. A separate video explains exactly how that mechanism works and why certain people keep arriving in our lives until we learn to name what they are asking of us. You will find it in the pinned first comment or in the code on screen. It is worth watching before you draw any conclusions about the person you are thinking of right now. But return, for a moment, to what is actually happening inside you. What you are experiencing, this growing difficulty pretending, this reluctance that feels almost physical when you are asked to compress yourself into a smaller shape, is not the wound. It only feels like a wound because you have been taught to read it that way. What it actually is the immune system finally functioning. There is a difference, and it matters, between the coldness of someone who has given up on people entirely and the discernment of someone who has learned, at considerable cost, that not every relationship was built to hold who they are becoming. One is withdrawal, the other is selection. One contracts the world, the other, slowly, makes it more real. Imagine a chandler who spent decades making candles for every room in a manor house. The grand hall, the servants' quarters, the rooms no one entered anymore, the corridors that led nowhere. One day he stops. Not because he no longer knows how to make candles, not because the wax runs out, but because he begins to ask, for the first time, which rooms actually need light, which doorways lead somewhere worth illuminating. The manor calls him unreliable. The empty corridors go dark. But in the rooms where people actually live, the light is steadier than it has ever been, because it is no longer being divided endlessly among spaces that were never inhabited. What others name as his withdrawal is simply the beginning of intention. The people who can no longer reach you are not villains in this story. Hold that. It is tempting, when the cost of a relationship becomes visible, to rewrite its history as a record of damage, to find the evidence you missed, to construct the narrative of someone who was always taking. But most of the time, that is not quite true. Most of the time, they are simply people who were comfortable with a version of you that you had to leave behind. They are not wrong to miss it. It genuinely served them. They are not lying when they say they preferred the earlier you. They simply preferred the arrangement. And arrangements, unlike people, cannot grow. Tolerance without self-respect is slow erosion. Discernment without bitterness is the beginning of real love. Schopenhauer, who watched human relationships with an unflinching and sometimes merciless eye, observed that much of what passes for intimacy is simply the forced proximity of people who share a context, a family, a workplace, a history, rather than a genuine resonance. He was not using this to justify withdrawal. He was naming something that most people feel but cannot articulate, that the exhaustion you carry after certain interactions is not a failure of effort, it is information. It is the body's quiet way of telling you that the connection was always costing more than it was returning. And perhaps that is worth sitting with for a moment. Not to condemn the relationship, not to rehearse the grievances, but simply to ask, what has this been teaching me about the distance between who I was performing and who I actually am? There is a word that does not get used enough in these conversations: translation. Every relationship requires it. You come from your interior, the other person comes from theirs, and somewhere in the space between you, meaning must be carried across. Most relationships manage this well enough, but there are others, and you know exactly which ones, where every conversation feels like translating into a language that has no word for what you are trying to say. You simplify. You approximate. You leave out the parts that would take too long to explain, and eventually you notice that you have left out so much that the version of you present in that conversation is barely a sketch of the whole, and the exhaustion you feel walking away is not from talking too much. It is from the sustained effort of making yourself smaller than you are. Imagine a musician who has spent years playing in a room where the acoustics flatten every note, where the overtones disappear, the resonance dies the moment it leaves the instrument, and every chord lands like something muffled and diminished. The musician does not conclude that music is impossible, but there is a particular kind of grief that comes from playing beautifully in a room that cannot hold the sound. It is not the room's fault. Rooms are built for different purposes. Some were never meant for music. The grief is real, and the musician is entitled to it. But so is the decision, made quietly and without drama, to find a room that was built to carry what the instrument is capable of producing. When the musician finally plays in that space, when the notes find the walls and come back transformed, fuller than they left, they do not call the old room a prison. They simply understand, perhaps for the first time, what playing was always supposed to feel like. Some relationships are not failures. They are rooms built for an earlier version of your music. What Jung understood, and what makes individuation genuinely difficult rather than merely uncomfortable, is that this process does not happen in a vacuum. You do not wake up in solitude and simply become yourself in peace. You wake up inside a web of expectations, histories, roles, and needs, and each step toward your own center is felt by everyone connected to the web. The friend who always relied on your quiet endurance feels the shift first. The family member who counted on your compliance notices before you have said a single word. The colleague who mistook your patience for agreement finds the new version of your responses unsettling in ways they may not be able to name. None of them are wrong to feel the change. They are responding accurately. Something has changed. You have changed. And the discomfort moving through the web is simply the tension of a structure adjusting, or refusing to adjust, to a new distribution of weight. This is why the growing intolerance can feel so disorienting. It arrives not as relief, but as grief. You expected to feel free. Instead, you feel the strange guilt of someone who has stopped pretending, and discovered that the pretending was load-bearing for everyone around them. But guilt and responsibility are not the same thing. You are not responsible for remaining legible to people who only learned to read one version of you. The quiet underneath the discomfort, if you can reach it, is not emptiness, it is space. And space, which the old life had no room for, is exactly what the next one is built from. There is a distinction worth sitting with here, because the mind tends to collapse it in moments of pain. There is the coldness of someone who has stopped believing in people altogether, who has retreated so far behind their own walls that nothing gets in and nothing gets out, who mistakes numbness for wisdom and distance for strength. And then there is something else entirely, the discernment of someone who has learned, at some cost, that not every relationship was built to hold who they are becoming. These two things can look identical from the outside. From the inside, they feel nothing alike. One is a closing, the other is a clarifying. Perhaps what you are living through right now is not the former wearing the mask of the latter. Perhaps the people who can no longer reach you are not being punished. They are simply encountering a boundary they never needed to consider before, because you never held one. They are not villains in this story. That is worth saying slowly, because the mind, once it begins to defend itself, will sometimes tip toward that comfort. They are people who learn to love a version of you that you had to leave behind. They are comfortable with the dynamic you have now outgrown. They may not even know that a dynamic existed. To them, this was simply how things were between you. And now things are different, and they feel the difference as a loss or a threat or a judgment, because they do not yet have language for what is happening either. Schopenhauer observed, quietly, without consolation, that much of human suffering comes not from tragedy, but from proximity, without genuine resonance, from the slow friction of remaining close to those with whom no real meeting ever occurs. He was not prescribing solitude. He was naming something most people spend a lifetime avoiding, that some distances are not failures of love, but the honest recognition that love alone cannot build a bridge if neither shore holds still. Tolerance without self-respect is slow erosion. Discernment without bitterness is the beginning of real love. Imagine a craftsman who has spent years working with green wood, wood that bends, that is still wet with its own becoming, that can be shaped into almost any form if enough pressure is applied for long enough. He is skilled at working with it. His whole workshop is built around its particular properties. Then, one day the wood has dried. It has hardened into its grain. It holds its form now. It does not bend the way it did. The craftsman picks it up and is confused, perhaps frustrated. He reaches for the same tools, applies the same pressure, and finds that the wood no longer yields. He may call it damaged. He may call it difficult. What he cannot see is that the wood has not broken. It has simply finished becoming what it was always going to be. Seasoned wood is not worse than green wood. It is what green wood was always moving toward. But it requires different hands to work with, or the willingness to set down the old tools entirely and learn something new. The people in your life are encountering seasoned wood now. Some of them will set down the old tools, some will not. And both of those responses are telling you something true. Here is what that truth does not mean. It does not mean the passage you are in ends in isolation. Jung was not describing a heroic retreat from the world. Individuation, in his understanding, is not a departure. It is a return. The goal was never to shed every relationship and stand alone in your own becoming, clear-eyed and untouchable. The goal was to return to the world without the performance, to be present by choice rather than by compulsion, to give from something that is actually there rather than from the exhausting fiction of an endless supply. The relationships that survive this passage, and some will, are built on something the others never were. They are built on the real version of you meeting the real version of another person, without either of you needing the meeting to be something it isn't. Those connections are rarer. They are also quieter than the ones built on mutual accommodation and careful silence. They do not require maintenance so much as they require honesty. And honesty, after years of careful performance, can feel almost violent in its simplicity. But perhaps that simplicity is what you were always looking for underneath the noise. The loneliness of this passage is real. Do not let anyone, including this reflection, rush you past it. It asks to be felt. But loneliness and solitude are not the same country, even when they share a border. Solitude is where you become legible to yourself. And once you are legible to yourself, once you